right, good afternoon, everybody. I would like to start our afternoon session by introducing our speaker for the contract management class. Mara Smith is the SPO Assistant Administrator who has been with us for over 20 years. During that time, she's been a subject matter expert in health and human services, has been a founding member for both HEPS and the follow-on e-procurement system HiPro. She is our expert trainer who is also my partner in crime when it comes to all things procurement. Please welcome Mara Smith.
Good afternoon. I know that this is your favorite session, the one we usually prop up our eyes with our toothpicks. So if you promise not to snore too loud, I won't either. Okay, so today we're going to talk about contract administration and management. Who needs to take this class? We don't often identify people as being specifically contract managers or contract administrators. But once we execute a contract, someone has to be responsible for overseeing it. In the old days, when we bought a tractor, and that's all we bought, someone just had to make sure that it was delivered. But these days, our procurements are not so simple. We don't buy as much goods and commodities or stuff. We buy more services, and even when we buy goods, we usually buy some kind of service with it, a warranty, maintenance, things like that. So contract administration is not something that can be done simply or in one fell swoop. Why is it important? Well, there are a number of reasons why it's important. It's important for the same reasons that you need to take care of a car once you buy it. We spend much more money now. Our procurements are, again, much more complex. So what are we going to do today? We'll do a brief overview of what contract management and administration is all about. We'll cover who the players are and some of the roles and responsibilities. We'll talk about what is meant by managing the contract, why it's important, and it can be a real eye-opener. There's a lot to manage, and that means you have to have a plan. I'll cover some of the most important things in contract management and administration, including a brief overview of contract changes and what it actually says in our statutes. Lastly, you'll see some of the golden rules of contract management and administration. If you remember these, then contract administration will be an effective and efficient process. So when I did some research on what contract management says, we received, there were a number of different kinds of definitions. There are all kinds of definitions. Some are event-based, everything from the point at which a contract is executed, or everything that happens from the point of awarding a contract. One definition defined it as all relationships between government and the contractor. That's kind of a lot. The GSA definition gives you a better idea of the scope of contract management. It includes all kinds of things: technical, financial, audit, legal, administrative, and managerial. Some places make a distinction between contract administration and contract management, while others use the terms interchangeably. That is, they mean the same thing. For the purposes of this training, consider the terms interchangeable. That is, contract management and contract administration mean basically the same thing. This is the GSA definition. Notice that it's event-based in the beginning. It says everything that takes place after the award to obtain compliance with such contract requirements as timely delivery, acceptance, payment, closing of the contract, et cetera, et cetera. But then further down in its definition, it says it may include additional tasks requested or needed by the contracting activity, including support in pre-award phase of contracting. And that means everything from the inception of the solicitation. Our HRS doesn't have a specific definition for contract management or administration, but it does have a definition for contract administrator. So basically, we can extrapolate by looking at the definition. Contract management is the management of the various facets of the contract to first and foremost ensure the contractor's performance is in accordance with the contract, and secondly, to ensure obligations to the purchasing agency are fulfilled. Earlier, I mentioned there are some golden rules for contract management, and this is a good time to start introducing them. First and foremost, if you don't take anything else home from today, know that for contract management, all contracts have to be managed. That is, let and forget doesn't work. Used to be, we did a huge amount of planning. We issued the solicitation, we worried it, we carried it along, we evaluated it, and we would sigh a sigh of relief once it was executed, thinking that the contract document would take care of it. But that's not true. Times have changed. As I said earlier, we buy few commodities and more services, and when we buy goods, we often have services along with them. It's not so simple anymore, and winging it just doesn't work. For large, complex contracts, this is even more true. That means it takes a team, and that means you got a plan. So who's on the team? We'll talk a little bit about the team, and then talk about some of their responsibilities. And then we'll also talk about inherently governmental functions. That is, there are some functions we can assign to team members. So who's going to do all this stuff for contract management? That's a good question. As contract administrator, you're ultimately responsible for ensuring it all gets done. But usually, you can't do it yourself. It helps to be organized. There are also other players. The team for planning the whole contract, the whole procurement comes into play. Let's start with the statutorily defined players. Here's a definition of the Chief Procurement Officer. Notice that, and a definition of the Procurement Officer. Notice that they're different, and they have very different roles. The Chief Procurement Officer usually doesn't have a large role when it comes to the point where you're managing the contract, unless something goes really wrong, or there's a procurement violation. It's entirely different for the Procurement Officer. The Procurement Officer is ultimately responsible for the whole procurement, and as you'll see, makes key decisions about contracts. You want to have those points of decision and approval well documented in writing to protect you, to protect the procurement officer, and to protect the state. Note that it says the procurement officer is any person delegated authority to enter into and administer contracts and make written determinations with respect thereto, and includes any authorized representative acting within the limits of authority. Next, we have the contract administrator, who we defined earlier. This is taken from HAR Section 3, 122-1. After the contract administrator, that's it for the documented roles in both the HRS and HAR, but there are certainly more individuals involved. These positions are not identified in the HRS or HAR, and they may be called different things by different divisions or offices: program specialist, engineer, botanist, etc. The program manager is the person who's responsible for managing the program for which the contract provides, the goods, services, or construction. In some instances, the program manager is the contract manager. They may be the same person. Other times, they're not. Users or end users can be the individuals or groups that will ultimately be using or may even be benefiting from the contract. Subject matter experts are individual persons who have expertise in the technical aspects of the goods, services, or construction for the contract. There may be times when they are employees of your or another department. For larger, more complex contracts, there may be times when your department procures and contracts for a subject matter expert. You may also have more than one SME. Because you need expertise in different areas. Stakeholders are individuals or groups with vested interest in the success of the contract. For instance, in the procurement for the statewide ERP system, in the state, there was an executive steering committee that met fairly regularly. Other roles. The solicitation coordinator is the person who usually manages issuing the solicitation and conducts it and covers it. The procurement officer approves the actions of the solicitation coordinator. Some departments have separate monitoring teams for technical or programmatic issues. There may also be a fiscal monitoring team or staff, especially if the contract is large, complex, or is using federal funds. Monitoring teams are sometimes used in monitoring contracts for health and human services as well. Again, one person may have more than one role. A SME may be on a monitoring team. The contract administrator and the program manager may be the same person. And of course, the contract manager can be the procurement officer, but is not always. One person may have more than one role. For larger, complex contracts, we may need help in the form of contracting expertise. This is especially true these days when almost everything we procure that's large involves some element of IT. There are advantages and disadvantages to having this. One advantage is you get the expertise that we don't have. One of the disadvantages is it gives you another contract to monitor and manage. And you also have a certain element of risk in that you have one contractor who has some level of oversight over another contractor. Even if the help is needed, there are certain responsibilities that the government cannot contract out. No matter who we hire, we're still ultimately responsible for managing the contract. There are certain functions that cannot be contracted out because they are inherently governmental in nature. The term for these, amazingly, is called inherently governmental functions. And they're addressed in Procurement Circular 2014-14. So what are these inherently governmental functions? Here's the list. Determining what to buy. Experts can make recommendations, but the government has the responsibility for the decision on what to buy. Approving solicitation documents to include things like the specs, the requirements, the scope of work, any incentives including in the solicitation or contract, and importantly, evaluation criteria. This doesn't mean that the state cannot contract for advice in these areas. It means that the final decision resides with the state. If something turns out to be false or bad, It's ultimately our responsibility. We can't put it off on a subcontractor. We can't hire anyone to negotiate cost or price. You know, those discussions before asking for a best and final offer. Only a government official can conduct those. We can't hire a contractor to do it. We can have a contractor to advise us while we're doing that. And of course, we can't have a contractor awarding a contract. We can give his advice, but the decision is ultimately the state's. Once a contract is executed, approving changes to an awarded contract, including but not limited to ordering changes in the scope, schedule, budget, taking any actions based on contractor performance, accepting or rejecting contract goods or services. Those are all inherently governmental functions. We can have somebody there to advise us. We can have somebody as the point person to go out and check with them, but the ultimate responsibility is ours. Likewise, we cannot assign out terminating a contract. Only we can do that. So what's the big deal with contract administration? What actually is it? I mean, a big fat document? No, it's a lot more than that. These are all the things that need to be managed, need the attention of the contract administrator or manager, and very often why they need a team. There also needs to be procedures for accomplishing the oversight of these things and for documentation. And in most cases, when you're overseeing these things, it's on a periodic or ongoing basis. It's not just once during a contract. Can't do all these things without a team, and that means you have to coordinate. In order to coordinate, you gotta have a plan, which leads us to our second golden rule. Planning is essential to good contract management. And by that, I mean planning ahead of time. By ahead of time, I mean from the point of planning for the entire procurement before the solicitation is even created. Contract management is one instance where flying by the seat of your pants really doesn't work. Contract administrators must be involved in planning for the procurement, not just contract management. If certain things are not in place in the solicitation, most times they cannot be added later. There also has to be a contract management plan. The contract administrator participates in the planning to ensure the contract will be manageable. So as I said, there are two kinds of training. All leads to the same thing, but there are two types of planning. Planning for the whole procurement and planning for contract management section. Like everything else, everyone has a perspective or point of view towards a project that comes from how it directly affects them. The person or people issuing the solicitation are mostly concerned with the solicitation, that it's solid, and that the procurement will go smoothly, that there are clear specifications and scope, so that there are not a lot of protests, and hopefully, if there are protests, they can be resolved quickly because the solicitation was well done. Not a whole lot of time is spent thinking about what happens after the award, even though that's the whole point of the award. How the contract will be managed and evaluated is mostly determined at the onset of the procurement. It all has to be in the solicitation. The offerers have to know what to expect. What kind of contract will it be? How will awards be evaluated as to whether and how well they're doing their job? How will they ensure quality in their work so that you can check on it? Is it something that is measurable? How will you, as the contract administrator, know the job is being done or is on course for being done? How will the contractor be paid, and what is the basis of issuing the payments? If you pay everything up front, good luck getting your contractor's attention, much less performance. That's why contract administrators have to be involved in the solicitation planning process. Basically, as contract administrators, you must look out for your own good. You saw this earlier. This is the procurement life cycle. Contract administrators, as I said, need to be involved from the beginning, from the procurement planning. I couldn't fit the whole life cycle on this slide. What's missing is a big arrow that leads from this last section, which is contract closeout and best practices, all the way back to the beginning, so that you can begin planning your next procurement. Here are several factors decided at the time of procurement, planning that directly affect contract administration. For instance, choosing the method of procurement. If the solicitation will be a bid, the main concern at time of procurement is who has the lowest price and can deliver the goods, services, or construction that are clearly specified and detailed in the solicitation. The offerer cannot propose something not in the solicitation. If you issue a competitive sealed bid, you are locked into the specs that are in the solicitation. Therefore, if this is the kind of service where you know that there may be certain circumstances may change, altering the deliverables, competitive sealed bid may not be the method for you to choose. If you're issuing a request for proposals, you're asking offerers to propose how to meet a problem or issue that you've defined clearly in the solicitation. As contract administrator, you want to think of the specifics the solicitation requires of the offerers so that when they respond, they're clear indicators of what the contractor will do, and you can manage it, and how it contributes to the final product. As contract administrator, you want to know what the contractor will do and how you'll know that the contract is meeting its goals. That can be fairly simple when you're procuring simple goods, but it's not so simple when you're procuring services. Large, complex procurements should include a summary of the performance requirements. That is what the contractor has to accomplish, and should also have a requirement that the offerers submit a quality control plan as part of the solicitation. That is, what will the contractor do to ensure the quality of what is being delivered is maintained? You will build your quality assurance plan based on their quality control plan. For example, a contract for custodial services for office bathrooms. If the contractor states that paper goods, that is, paper towels and TP, will be checked twice a day, your quality assurance plan might be to randomly check the bathrooms for paper towels and TP. Please note that if the procurement method selected is competitive seal proposals, the contract administrator must at least be on the evaluation committee, if not heading it. These are all the items that must be addressed or answered when you're developing a solicitation. Almost all of them directly affect how the contract is managed. If how we manage performance is spelled out in the solicitation, it makes your job as managing the contract so much easier during the contract. The same is true for method of payment or payment schedule. You also want to address whether subcontracting is allowed, and if it is allowed, what kind of requirements flow down to the subcontractors. Requiring the vendor to submit a quality control plan helps you develop your quality assurance plan, and you are more likely to start from a mutual point of understanding, rather than having to enter into discussions, extended discussions in the beginning of the contract and throughout the contract to clarify. Planning for contract management, of course, is different for every contract. One size doesn't fit all. For example, a more simple contract could be as simple as defining what delivery and acceptance is and payment for delivery. Or it could be much more involved and involve various staff, program and audit, for the life of the contract. In summary, you want to see clear specifications, appropriate procurement method, good evaluation criteria, not only evaluation criteria that's measurable, but evaluation criteria that measures what you want to get. And lastly, you most definitely want to ensure that payments are linked to satisfactory performance. Other things that have to be identified in procurement planning are risks. You want to find out what those risks are, and you want to have a plan for, one, mitigating the risks, and two, what you're going to do should the risk come to pass. You also want to have an understanding of what the end users need. If you don't have an understanding of what the end users need, as contract administrator, you're going to have to mediate all through the contract between the end user and the contractor, any disagreements. Here's a summary of what should be included in the solicitation, so you can create and manage your great contract management plan. When you create the plan for the contract management, these are the items that will be needed. This is a listing of the components. Some of them are pretty redundant, so all you need to do is copy them. For a simple contract management plan, there isn't much you need. Contractor info, the government info, the details of the contract, payment schedule, milestones, reporting requirements, administrative requirements like compliance. You'll also want to address vendor management, communication, risk assessment and review, quality assurance, and administrative requirements. And lastly, contract review. How will you review the contract, and who will review the contract at the end of it to ensure that the next time you issue this kind of solicitation or a similar one, you do a better job? How is that information communicated? Does your contract require a great deal of vendor management? Does it require oversight? When will it be done, and by whom? How often will you meet? What are some of the communication lines that have to be open, and who will be on those communication lines? In your quality control plan, you want to include both unscheduled and scheduled site visits. In a complex contract management plan, you're going to need a little more. You're going to need a section on the contract structure because it will be more complex and you want to break it down. You'll need more definition on the roles and responsibilities. You'll also want to identify the contract conditions, the general, the special, any contract variations, insurance. You'll also want to address the financial aspects of the contracts, not only payment, but how the money is being spent. And of course, performance measurement. You want your deliverables, incentives, disincentives. What are the monitoring? In administration, what are the contractor obligations? They may involve service level agreements. Almost always need transition plans. One of our biggest faults is that we create huge contracts, we have them extend for 5 years, and then we have absolutely no plan for when that contract ends, and we have to resolicit. If we resolicit and the same vendor wins, we're in luck. But what if another vendor wins? What is the transition plan? That needs to be there from the beginning. Communication is critical, and I don't just mean a few emails. Who needs to communicate with the contractor? Who needs to communicate with the procurement officer if, as contract administrator, you're not that person? Who communicates with the program manager, any subject matter experts, the end users, the fiscal staff, stakeholders, and in some cases, you need to communicate with the community. What do you need to talk about? Well, what about the progress of the contract? Any changes that need to be made to the contract? Any problems? And how is performance being measured? And like everything else, how often are we going to do this? Is it a time interval? Are we going to communicate every month upon deliverables that are received? When we get a complaint? When we issue a survey? When? And then what format will communication take? We have emails, we have meetings, we have formal letters, we can send out newsletters, for instance, to stakeholders and the community, and we also have surveys and complaint forms. When we talk about vendor relationship, we also mean vendor management. And again, some of the things are redundant. How is the communication going to occur? Who are the contacts and what are their roles? Is any reporting by the vendor required? When we have meetings, who schedules them and when are you going to do a site visit? What are the expectations, the milestones, the deliverables? We want to have a plan for disputes. If there is a dispute, how do we elevate it? And lastly, does the contractor have to work with another contractor? In our more complex contracts, sometimes that's true. One contract delivers IT, the other one delivers IV&V. Are they required to work together? If so, who's going to oversee that? That also falls under the jurisdiction of the contract manager. As I mentioned earlier, we want to get a list of what the risks are. For each risk, we want to describe it. We want the plan to mitigate the risk, so hopefully it won't happen. We want an action plan on what will happen if the risk is realized. Who is assigned to monitor, and how often are they going to monitor? That is, how high is it? Who will act if action is required? We want to include how often the risk assessment will have to be reviewed for new risks, and by whom. New risks come up, old ones decrease, methodology for mitigating the risks may change, and then we always want to realize that the assumptions in a contract are also low-level risks. For quality assurance, we want to ensure the quality of the goods, services, of construction. We want to build it from a quality control plan that's submitted by the contractor. That way we have agreement across the board. We want to assure what kind of quality assurance activities we're going to have. Is it going to be in-house? Are we going to do it by external parties or a combination of both? And we need to have some kind of mechanism for analysis of performance data for those more complex contracts. In quality assurance, planning has to be started in the solicitation phase. And it will be developed further on after we review the quality control plan submitted by the awardee. We need to review this plan periodically because sometimes it can be outdated. And we want to report on the dictates of the plan fairly regularly. And as I mentioned before, in addition to planned site visits, you want to plan also at least one random site visits. I mentioned transition before, the what if. What if the vendor flakes out? What if the vendor does not win the next time we issue the contract? What's the plan for transition to a new contractor at a contract end? Should another vendor be awarded, or we have to terminate the contract? How will records be disposed of? How will equipment be taken care of? How is transition of services be carried out? For IT, we have way more things to consider. What about codes, logins and passwords, intellectual property rights, data that is on platforms, applications, ownership of data collected, things like that. All of those we want to plan for. Another portion of contract management that should be part of the plan are things like ethics, conflict of interest, and confidentiality. We need to ensure throughout our procedures that we're fair, impartial, consistent, that we maintain security and that we maintain confidentiality, and that we have a procedure for identification of conflicts or potential conflicts of interest. And we also want to make sure that information is only available to those who need it. For complex contracts, we may have to have staff sign NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. They may need to be signed by all parties. You should know whether you need one, who needs to sign it, and who needs to get it done. I tried to put together a flow chart of contract management. It's kind of squishy on this item, but it should be clearer in your handout. A lot of the things I noticed were not really very sequential. A lot of things it is an iterative process where you're continually going back. Which brings us to golden rule number 3, know your contract. And by that I mean, don't just know that you have general conditions and special conditions, and don't just know that there's a clause for this and a clause for that in the general and special conditions or any attached documents, but really know them and understand them. What do they mean? And what are the implications for your contract? In the fiscal management area of your contract, you at the very least want to have what is known as a burn rate log. And this can be an Excel sheet that you set up ahead of time with formulas where you enter the funds you have at the start of the contract. You enter your expectations or your estimates for how much will be spent each month or each quarter, depending on how the contract runs. And then as invoices come in, you enter them and you get to keep a running total of what was spent, what you expected would be spent, and how much trouble you're in, and whether you need to get some additional funds. This way, there's no surprises, you don't run out of funding unexpectedly, and you know when you'll need a contract modification should you need more funds. Which brings us to the next section, contract mods. In our statute, there are basically 2 kinds of modifications for contracts, unilateral and bilateral. Unilateral contracts are commonly known as change orders. They're not used very much in goods and services, more so in construction, and they're generally smaller in nature. Just keep in mind that if you're doing a change order, the vendor is entitled to just compensation, and they may make a claim. The other kind of modification is known as a bilateral, and that means mutual understanding, mutual agreement. So let's talk a little bit about bilateral. They're typically called contract mods in the HAR. They have to be within the scope of the contract. As you can see, there are a number of items. As you can see, there are a number of items that can be amended. I want to emphasize that it is a mutual, as in both parties, agreement have to agree to this. They must be fair, and the costs must be established as being fair and reasonable. That makes it pretty open. So what do you want to consider? Well, you want some guiding principles. You must be fair. You must consider what was said in the solicitation. Would more or different vendors have applied if they had known that this type of change could occur? You must be transparent. If you know a particular change is likely to occur, you should put it in your solicitation. Of course, it must all be documented, and not just in writing, but you want the justification for any change documented in the contract file itself. You want to include the reason and how you arrived at the cost and found it to be fair and reasonable. Lastly, it has to be signed by the procurement officer, which brings us to rule number 4. Document, document, document. Vendors, contractors, providers, and contract managers oftentimes suffer from SML, or selective memory loss. Therefore, it's really important to commit in writing as soon as possible any calls, requests, decisions, activities relating to the contract. If there is discussion, be sure that it's repeated back to the other party and confirm your understanding of the discussion. It's also important that team managers are informed and understand the importance of keeping the contract manager informed and abreast of any kinds of messages, including emails, verbal discussions, written communications that may affect the contract in any way. Remember, these people speak for the state, and they may unwittingly commit us to things that we have to honor. The contract manager should have, for the record, a copy of all documents relating to the project. Life would be so much simpler if we had the pertinent answers at hand and the appropriate documents, rather than pulling hairs, trying to find out who said what to who to answer a question at hand. So let's talk a little bit about some of the contract changes. When you're making a change to a quantity in a definite quantity contract, a definite quantity contract, for instance, is a contract that says, I want to buy 50 widgets. The definition, there is a statement that must be in the contract about changes to definite quantity contracts. If you're using the AG standard contract form, it's in the general conditions. If not, then you should check HAR 3125-8, because this section must be in there. It states that increases in definite quantity contracts cannot be more than 10%. Furthermore, it says that the procurement officer must find and give justification in the contract file for why it is not economical to reprocure or feasible. For contract modifications that allow price adjustments, again, there has to be a statement in the contract. The contract, the AG general conditions does have that statement. If you're not using the AG contract, please check HAR 3125-12 and make sure it's in your contract. The contractor must provide cost and pricing data and certify it is accurate. It must be computed based on a number of the issues listed here, fixed price or unit price specified in the contract or agreed upon prior to performance. You make that in writing. Costs have to be attributable to events or situations. They may be something that you come to an agreement ahead of time, or they can be done in another manner that's mutually agreed upon prior to performance. Protect yourself. Always, always put it in writing. Lastly is contract closeout. We're almost done. Next is contract closeout. The most important thing is to have procedures for your contract closeout and not just let it fade away. If you don't close your contract, there may be unspent funds in your contract that will have to go back to general funds. And sometimes contract managers don't know about that. If the contract uses federal funds, there's likely to be a reporting requirement. So please make sure that you know what those requirements are because you will need some data from your vendors. You also want to set aside some time for discussion and recording of your lessons learned and your best practices for future contracts. Who are you going to discuss this with? End users, the contractor, and maybe program managers or beneficiaries of the contract. Again, in contract administration and management, as we come to a contract close, you want some kind of checklist. Were the deliverables met? Were invoices correct? Were payments to the vendor timely? Did any terms or conditions prove to be a challenge? Do they need to be modified in the next contract? In summary, be familiar with your contract, the details of the contract, for an understanding of the roles and responsibilities and ability to interpret the contract in case a question arises. Prioritize your documents by importance and precedence. Very often, you will see statements that should there be a conflict between the solicitation and the contract, one will have precedence. When you have multiple documents dealing with the same issue, the latest documents usually have the highest priority. When you have multiple documents on the same subject matter, such as drawings and specifications, the written word provides usually has precedence. When documents are part of contracts by reference and there are no conflicts and requires everything to be formed, then these documents should become prioritized in the mix as well. Some don'ts. Don't start your contract prior to having an executed contract. Do not issue a notice to proceed before your contract is executed. The term cannot be extended of your contract can't be extended after the fact. If you allow your contract to die, don't laugh. This is one of the biggest sources of procurement violations. If you allow your contract to die and then try to extend it, you cannot, because you don't have anything to extend. It no longer exists. Don't sign anything without proper authorization. If you're a contract manager and not the procurement officer, you always want to check with the procurement officer unless authority has been delegated to you. Don't approve any invoices without verifying that the products have been received and at the contracted price. Don't rely solely on verbal communications or even emails. Use emails over verbal communications and written documentation that's signed over that. Lastly, don't postpone administrative action or documentation simply because a vendor promises to comply. Some problem areas in contract administration and management: too much time in the front and the back. We take too much time to execute or close out contracts. It's difficult to deliver the services or the goods when we have a shortened time for delivery. Most times, it takes a team. They have to know what their responsibilities are, so it's important to communicate. You want to monitor your contract, again, using communication. Vendors and providers should know what you're watching. It promotes them understanding what you're looking for, and as we all know, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. If you're communicating with your vendors, they know you're paying attention. They're more likely to pay attention to your contract. In summary, here's a higher level checklist. We have touched on most of these items, and I think that's the end. Here's your checklist for during the contract. Again, all items we've talked about: the payment log or the burn rate log, meeting with your contractor on a regular basis and conducting unannounced visits, and a summary of the golden rules. If you can follow these 4 golden rules, remember that you've got to manage it. It's got to be planned. You got to know your contract, and you want to document everything. Thank you.